This is Lena live from Belgium. Continue on the subject of COVID-19 and world issues regarding fighting this disease and regarding scientific connection with handling this disease. We have a particular privilege of having a part of our discussion an extraordinarily gifted scientist. Her name is Dr. Stephanie Seneff, who is a senior research scientist at the Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, which is, of course, a world-famous institution, which is located in United States, Boston, Massachusetts. Stephanie, I'd like to invite you for this discussion and to thank you profoundly, because it's very hard to find today such a scientist who is incredibly honest, with a high integrity for scientific truth, for scientific progression. I would say that you're thriving in controversy with fuel of even extra truth and extra dimension for the progress of the handling this truly devilish virus. Before I will go into some questions, I just wanted to warn public that my desire and my hope to cover large territory, taking advantage of spectrum of your knowledge, which is, by the way, covering biophysics, electrical engineering, and computer science, and all of this in one person. So that already speaks with tremendous uniqueness of who you are. So I like to continue on what we already started a little bit in our emails. You expressed some interest and your own personal, if not investigation, but your personal interpretation of mRNA. And I like to start from this, but then I like to shift to some other issues regarding other vaccinations and some other issues of the viruses and etc. So I will stop talking now and I will give you the stage, and just start from any place you feel it's logical.
Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to talking with you about this topic. I've been very absorbed trying to learn all about the messenger RNA vaccines and also the DNA-based vaccine by AstraZeneca that Europe is grappling with right now. I think we should talk about that as well, because that's also very interesting. As you know, Pfizer and Moderna are the two companies that have produced these different but very similar mRNA vaccines, and they're being people in the United States are being inoculated with these vaccines in huge numbers right now. A huge experiment that has been unleashed, which I just find very disturbing. Just the fact that we were driven to decide to do something like this is astonishing to me. That the risk of something this new, the unknowns are enormous. They just have such grossly inadequate study of the potential consequences of these vaccines prior to unleashing it on the entire population. I think it's just astonishing that they are willing to take that risk. And of course, part of why they're willing is because they negotiate with countries. Pfizer, for example, is really playing hardball to make sure that if there are a bunch of people who come forward with, accusations that this vaccine killed their loved one or whatever, if Brazil doesn't have enough money to actually cover the cost, then Brazil has to offer collateral, and public even military bases. I mean, it's just incredible what's coming up with Pfizer, making tremendous demands on countries that are then finally just refusing the vaccine because they can't deal with those demands. So there's the companies that are producing these vaccines understand there's a potential for extremely dangerous outcomes, and for that, that's the way they play the game, these people, and I find it very, very disturbing. So that, I mean, the mRNA vaccines are fascinating. It's fascinating science, and I have to say that the the biotech industry is on fire right now. They have been coming up with incredible skills to manipulate genetics and playing with life, really. And then they're very, very excited about potential opportunities for tremendous potential in terms of even being able to correct severe genetic mistakes and things like that. So they feel that this technology has a much, much wider potential use than simply vaccination. Of course, vaccination is making a huge amount of money for them all by itself. And if it does manage to get through without tearing us to shreds, so to speak, this will be the beginning of a new era in biotech that will be extremely exciting, where we're basically playing God. We're going beyond what's natural in huge ways that I think has to have very dangerous, unforeseen, unknown consequences. And that's kind of the general message I would like to get out. Now, I've looked at this messenger RNA technology, read a lot of papers. I've actually written a paper together with a colleague, which is under review. I'm hoping that we can get that published, but for the moment, that's just under review. It's the vaccine works in a very strange way. Basically, they've learned how to. One thing that has happened in biophysics is that they've learned how to make a DNA sequence. DNA is the genetic code. It's this 4-letter code with the nucleotides, the 4 nucleotides. That's very basic in biology. And they've learned how to sequence any particular sequence you want of DNA through commoditized methods. You just basically, go to the resource and you order your supply of this DNA that's exactly sequenced according to your code that you want. So that gives tremendous power to the biologists to be able to control what they make. And so what they've done is they've got a sequence that exactly matches the protein, the spike protein in the virus. And they just make a DNA sequence that is the code for that spike protein. And that spike protein is very, very important to the virus. It both allows it to attach to the cells at the ACE2 receptors and allows it to get into the cell. That same protein does both of those things for the virus. So it's a crucial, crucial protein for the virus. What they've done with the vaccine is they put only that protein in the vaccine. The rest of the virus is missing, which is very interesting. They don't even put the protein in the vaccine. They put the code for the protein. And they put the code in the form of RNA, not DNA. So to make this RNA, they start with this DNA sequence that they just order up, from the service. And then they add an enzyme that converts DNA to RNA to a it's an in vitro situation with no cells. So this is actually very safe with respect to not having any danger of getting some kind of other contaminations in there from living systems, which is not the true for the AstraZeneca vaccine. The AstraZeneca vaccine actually has to grow cells in culture to produce it. So that's a huge distinction. Because of this clean way of making the vaccine that does not involve cells, it's much safer in terms of not having contaminants in there that might be from those cells that were grown to produce the vaccine. So that's a big feature of messenger RNA vaccines, that they're clean in terms of how they're produced. But they have to modify that RNA in strange ways to keep it from being broken down. The problem, DNA is much sturdier, and this is another difference between the AstraZeneca vaccines and the mRNA vaccines. DNA doesn't have to be kept at ridiculously cold temperatures the way the RNA does. It's a single-strand RNA in the mRNA vaccines versus a double-strand DNA in the AstraZeneca vaccine. And so the AstraZeneca has a feature that you don't have to worry about it falling apart if it gets too warm, which is a risk for these messenger RNA vaccines. So they make this vaccine as this RNA, and then they change the RNA. They actually change one of the nucleotides. There's 4 components, and out of those 4, there's one that they change into a different thing across the board. making it into a very weird form of RNA that doesn't exist in nature already just because they do that. It's not a normal RNA. And then they add a big tail on it called a poly-A tail, which helps to keep it stable. And then they throw in this polyethylene glycol, which also helps to keep it stable. And then they wrap it around it a lipid membrane made of a fat. So they're doing all of this. They're creating a lipid particle with this RNA hiding inside it. And they have to do all of that extra stuff so that the RNA won't break down. Because normally, if you're exposed to single-strand RNA out in the open, it's just going to fall apart immediately. The enzymes are going to start attacking it. As soon as you start attacking it with enzymes, it won't make the protein anymore. So it's absolutely crucial for them to keep it from getting broken down, which means then that it sticks around a long time. And that is extremely abnormal. So what happens is this particle comes in from the vaccine. There's lots and lots of these little tiny particles called nanoparticles. Each one has a lipid membrane around it that hides the RNA inside it so that enzymes can't get to it. And then that polyethylene glycol, which many people, something like 80% of our population has immune reactions to polyethylene glycol. So there's an issue of that causing anaphylactic shock that we're now very much aware of. That's one problem. But the RNA itself, so what happens is that this lipid particle gets seen as if it's a normal, what's called an exosome. Cells normally release lots and lots of these exosomes, which are little lipid particles. They use those to deliver things, to share goods among one another. So when the cell sees this lipid particle, it thinks it's just a normal exosome and takes it right up. And it's the immune cells that grab up these lipid particles, that they go into the lymph system when they do that. So when you get the vaccine on your arm, one of the things that happens with women is they get swollen lymph nodes under their arm. That is a very strong feature of breast cancer. So normally when women have those swollen lymph nodes, they suspect breast cancer and they'll have you do a biopsy to see if you've got breast cancer. They've been sending out messages now, so don't worry if you just got your vaccine, it's probably not breast cancer. But you wonder if it's causing the lymph nodes to swell, what else is it doing, right? It could be leading towards, some kind of cancer, I would think. It goes from the lymph nodes and then it ends up in the spleen in huge amounts, which is very interesting to me. The immune cells travel through the lymph system and go to the spleen because they've actually been able to trace the RNA. They don't know much about this technology because it's so new, but they do know. They've done tracer studies where they can find out where it goes, and it goes into the spleen and it goes into the liver. But most of it goes into the spleen. So the spleen gets a huge concentration of these, huge numbers of these immune cells are arriving in the spleen, loaded up on this mRNA stuff inside these nanoparticles. And those immune cells then open up the nanoparticle, release the RNA, and then it looks like a normal, they've rigged it so it looks just like a normal human RNA about to make protein. They've got it all set up to go. Very, very abnormal from the standpoint of what the virus would have done. But when the human cell sees this, it thinks, oh, this is a normal human RNA code. I need to make this protein. And those immune cells start making lots of this spike protein, which is the protein that this virus needs. And then the immune cells display that spike protein on their surface or release it into the system. And then that can cause all kinds of problems. The spike protein itself, which is being made by the human cells, can cause all kinds of problems. And then because that spike protein, it will cause an immune reaction. That's the whole point. They want you to get antibodies to the coronavirus.
Yes.
Because, yes.
Yeah, that's, you predicted my thoughts. Leading, how can we get those goods?
Right. So it produces the protein. Then the other immune cells that are specializing in making antibodies make the antibodies to those spike proteins. Now the problem is that the spike protein has lots of sequences in it that are closely resembling sequences in many different human proteins that are known to be a problem in autoimmune disease. So what's going to happen, I think, is that we're going to see a large increase, I'm predicting, and we don't know yet, in autoimmune disease. We already have an epidemic in autoimmune disease in the United States. Things like celiac disease and rheumatoid arthritis and multiple sclerosis. I mean, all kinds of nasty things that are related to overactive immune system, overactive adaptive immune system, producing antibodies that are attacking the human proteins. And there are many of these sequences. There's a paper that talked about specific sequences in the spike protein that are going to cause the immune system to get confused and end up attacking the human proteins instead. And that's how you'll get an increase in all these autoimmune diseases. So that's one problem. The spike protein has also been shown to be toxic. Like people have seen issues with the brain. There's a syndrome, post-COVID syndrome, where people are having sort of brain fog and this kind of thing. Yeah. And studies showed that the spike protein all by itself is toxic to the brain. You don't need the whole virus. You just need the spike protein. So these immune cells are there with this RNA they can't break down because it's so sturdy. So they keep on making spike protein for God knows how long. And it's just a super, and it gets into the circulation, it gets into the brain. I mean, I think the spike protein itself is really dangerous. And then there's been this thing about blood clots and platelets dropping to zero. There have been several cases in the United States where the platelet count suddenly goes way down, which gives you the risk of a hemorrhage, a brain hemorrhage, for example. And there was I think a 54-year-old doctor in Florida whose platelets came down to zero. They couldn't find any platelets when they were measuring his platelets, and they could not make them go up. And then he died of a brain hemorrhage, a stroke, basically. And so there were several other cases like that as well. So you've got the problem, and that is also connected to the disseminated intravascular coagulation, or this sort of massive blood clots throughout the body, which we're seeing both with the AstraZeneca vaccine and with the messenger RNA vaccines. And I think that, again, is due to when in the spleen holds 1/3 of the body's platelets. 30% of the platelets are in the spleen. So the spleen is getting all the spike protein being released by all these macrophages, and that is probably binding to the platelets, I'm guessing. This is a bit of conjecture at this point, causing the immune system to attack the platelets, is what I'm suspecting. And so once the immune system is attacking the platelets just get wiped out. And then you have the problem of the blood clots and the hemorrhaging. Right. Well, I need to bring in glyphosate at this point. You probably know that I'm very obsessed with glyphosate. Yes. I think it is the most dangerous chemical in our environment today.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So right. No, I'm pretty sure Belgium is not immune. The United States uses more glyphosate per person than any other country in the world, and we also have by far the most expensive healthcare system. Those two are connected. Yeah. And I've written a book on glyphosate called Toxic Legacy. It's about to be released in June. It should come out. It's available for pre-order right now on Amazon. And there's a whole chapter in that book on the immune system. And I believe that glyphosate is severely disabling the innate immune system. We have normally a very healthy, powerful immune system that doesn't need any kind of specialization. It sees any kind of a threat, it knows how to clear it. And normally when you have a healthy immune system, cold viruses could come around all they want and you never get a cold. That's me, for example. I haven't had the flu or a cold or anything for many, many years. If you've got a healthy innate immune system, you are immune to, naturally speaking, these invasive species that might cause trouble otherwise. You can fight them off without ever developing a single antibody, I suspect. And I think the antibodies are an admission that when you produce antibodies, that's an admission of failure of your innate immune system. You should not need to produce antibodies that are specific to a particular microbe or any kind of a pathogen if you have a strong immune system. And what we're doing with these vaccines is we're bypassing entirely the innate immune system on purpose. We want to go straight to the adaptive immune system. We want to make those antibodies. That's the whole goal. If those antibodies are made and they're specific to exactly that particular version of the spike protein, then we will be protected immediately. They'll be ready to go when you get infected with the virus, and that will cause you to have a much better chance of clearing the virus. So that's what's the good thing about the vaccine. It gives you that specific, very, very sharp laser specific gun that can kill those viruses very quickly, because you have those antibodies ready to go. But when you do that, those antibodies are so specific that even another strain of that same virus, the SARS-CoV-2, with a different form of that spike protein, those antibodies can no longer see that. It's like it doesn't work anymore. And what's happening, I believe, is that when we're doing this massive vaccination campaign, we're going to cause people who have a very weak immune system, they get the vaccine, they make the antibodies, but they don't actually have the capacity to clear the virus, even with those antibodies, because their immune system is so weak. Even the antibodies are not enough to let them clear the virus. This gives the virus an opportunity to mutate within that person's body. And so that person is going to be able to keep the virus alive for many, many generations, while the virus quickly figures out how to change its spike protein to be no longer sensitive to that antibody. And now we have a vaccine. So then, and also that new virus, these new strains are showing up in the UK, in South Africa, in Brazil, in the United States. We're seeing these new strains of the virus that are much more contagious and sometimes also more virulent. And they pretty much take over the population once they get started. The other virus gets, squeezed out by this new form that is not sensitive or less sensitive to the vaccine. So I think what I'm predicting is going to happen, on top of all this increase in autoimmune disease, is we're going to have new strains of the virus showing up around the world, insensitive to the vaccine. Now they have to go back to the drawing board. Now the good news is they can make new versions of that spike protein. They have the formula, just make some more DNA, different strain, right? They know the sequence, they look it up, the new ones that are dangerous, and they make a whole bunch more. So they're going to have a version of the vaccine, I predict. I don't know, it's going to have 20 different sequences of spike protein or 100 different sequences of spike protein. I don't know what they're going to do, but they're going to have a much more complex, I suspect, vaccine. They're going to say, hey, guys, we got to do this all again now because the old one's broken, doesn't work anymore. And how often will that happen? How long will that happen? How many times will the virus be able to weasel its way out of a jam? We don't know. But I think there's a possibility that we're going to be doing this double round, 2 vaccines spaced a month apart every few months. I mean, I don't know. The future is unknown, right? But it's a possibility.
Actually, that's already happens because the variants of this virus happens after a few months. We thought that we're stabilizing. Sorry, just exactly what you said. It's already 3rd variants inside of 1 year.
Right, we have many, many different variants. I mean, it's amazing. There was this one article that was really fascinating about a person in the UK who had cancer. And they had cancer, they were being treated with these very toxic drugs that wreck your innate immune system. So they have immune deficiency because of the drugs. They catch COVID, they're very sick, they go to the hospital. This person stayed in the hospital for 101 days. They had him in an isolation room with, protected circulation because they were terrified. He was shedding the virus the entire 101 days. He was shedding the virus. They could not get it under control. They gave him antibodies. They gave him plasma from people who had recovered from COVID-19. His body was so sick he couldn't make antibodies. He couldn't use antibodies either because they gave him these antibodies from these other people. Didn't do any good. He couldn't kill the virus. By the time he died, they looked at what he had, and he had a single strain, or pretty much one strain that was dominant in his body, a new strain that had at least a dozen different mutations. I mean, the spike protein was changed in a major way in that one person by that virus as it evolved to weasel its way out of a jam with these antibodies. With such a weak innate immune system, the antibodies didn't work. That's the situation that's extremely dangerous. When we do all these vaccines, we are basically essentially giving antibodies to people who can't use them right. And we're going to just have a lot more people. Somebody in the hospital getting plasma is not that common. But when we're massively vaccinating the entire population, including all these other people with cancer who don't have a strong immune system, we're really inviting disaster as far as the virus just mutating into different strains. It's going to be, I think, uncountable numbers of different strains that are in various degrees resistant to the vaccine.
And if I understood correctly, it's because human reaction and almost like a vicious cycle, because this virus has such a good time in invading. It's overly populating the body, mutating, and the body just giving up. But it's very clear what you explained. I have one question, but of course, this is from general public. In ideal world, is it possible to make a very thorough physiological test for an individual, blood work, urine, etc., and to determine how his physiology can coincide in the best, less harmful way with a particular vaccine. Because we have now 3 vaccines, it will be probably more. Is there any possible correlation to adapt for the particular individual who will need to make a decision?
Well, I mean, I think you could. I think an important thing is, for example, vitamins. There's many different vitamin deficiencies that we have, and vitamin D is an obvious one. So you can certainly measure serum vitamin D levels. And there was a study that showed that people who had low serum vitamin D had a 4-fold increased risk to dying from COVID-19. So vitamin D is a really important one. I try very hard to get out in the sunlight as much as I can. I've done that for a very long time to make sure that I have adequate sun exposure. I think sunlight exposure is one of the best things you can do. It's perfectly free. Just go outside, sit outside and read a book, take a walk, just be in the sunlight to boost your vitamin D. I think that's really probably the most important, well, the second most important thing you can do. The first most is to eat a certified organic and stay away from glyphosate. Completely avoid glyphosate. That means not only in your food, but also in your water, in your air. You need to worry about glyphosate in your air, and that's something I'm very intrigued by. I don't know if you're aware that I have a theory about air pollution and COVID-19. You see that the first 3 places where there were hotspots were Wuhan in China, and then the Lombardy region in northern Italy, and then New York City. Those 3 really stood out as a huge influx of hospital patients who were dying from COVID-19, overwhelming the hospital system. And those 3 cities have something in common, which is that they all have high air pollution, high levels of nanoparticles. But on top of that, I think there's also glyphosate in the air. And this is a theory. I haven't proven this, but I highly suspect it. And I think it has to do with biofuels. And so that's a whole area that I got into this year. I didn't really know much of anything about biofuels until COVID hit. And then when I noticed that pattern with those 3 cities, I started looking into biofuels, and it turns out that industry is thriving. We've had a huge increase in the use of biofuels in the last few years. And these biofuels are derived from things like GMO crops that are sprayed with glyphosate, or crops that are sprayed right before the harvest. For example, you have a wheat crop, you spray it with glyphosate, you harvest the wheat, and then you take the stubs that have been sprayed with glyphosate and you ship them on a barge down to New York City and you turn them into biofuel. New York City has been a very big leader in switching over to biofuels. It's supposed to be, good because you're avoiding the consumption of fossil fuels. It's a good thing, and people get credit for it. But when you mix glyphosate into it, I think it becomes very, very dangerous. And even, for example, New York has this, massive amounts of sewage, and they have this very big 50-acre place in the heart of New York City where they process New York's sewage. And they are very proud of these biodigester eggs. They have these 5 or 6 eggs that take that sewage and turn it into biogas. And the biogas goes directly into the city to supply some of the gas to the city. It goes into these pipes. I mean, the city is old, so it probably has leaky pipes. You typically have leaky pipes under old cities. So if you imagine the biogas loaded up on glyphosate going through leaky pipes and just getting out into the air, in the city, people are going to breathe the glyphosate. So when you breathe it, you're getting it directly into the lungs. Glyphosate wrecks the immune system, I believe, according to my book. And it's going to hurt the immune system in the lungs, which is going to make you very, very susceptible to the COVID-19 virus. This is what I think is happening. And that's why I think these cities were hit so hard when they first encountered that virus.
Yes. You gave such a clear and thankfully, in some way, very doable, connections with Mother Nature, and something which we can exclude and something which we can add. I cannot thank you enough for this enormous globe information. Only if your time permits, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. The last time we had the conversation, I didn't have a chance to ask about your life, what put you in this long, most incredible journey. And perhaps you can make an arch between where you start as a scientist and where we are now, and how artificial intelligence is a part of all of this, activities of yours. I'm dying to know if you can
Yes.
answer at your own rights.
It's hard to know where to begin with that, but I do think my computer science training has helped me to have a different approach to studying biology from what most biologists do. And so I sort of like to connect dots, and so I read a lot of literature, and then I try to build a story around it in biology, and that's sort of been my modus operandi, synthesis in biology. And I think there's a wealth of literature out there that anybody can read. It's really a wonderful time for someone who wants to just dig deep into the research of biology, how it works, and how these chemicals are disrupting it. Glyphosate is actually a wonderful, wonderful window on biology because it disrupts things. So when it disrupts things, you get disease. And I basically look at disease trends. So one of the things I can do with my computer science skills is to look at correlations among various diseases and different chemicals. And that's what led me to glyphosate, because there's a very, very strong correlation between the rise, when you look at a plot over time of the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops and the rise in a huge list of diseases. I can list several of them: autism, Alzheimer's, various gut problems, gut dysbiosis, microbiome messed up, liver disease, kidney disease, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, diabetes, obesity, rheumatoid arthritis. I mean, there's just a huge list. Celiac disease. These diseases are all going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage, probably across the world, but certainly within the U.S. The correlations are stunning. They have, the two curves in many. Autism versus glyphosate usage on core crops over the previous 4 years, autism for 6-year-olds against glyphosate from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in that child's life. Those two curves coincide. They absolutely coincide. Yes. I think glyphosate is the primary reason for the autism epidemic that we have in America. Right now it's 1 in 54. The latest number was 1 in 54. It's an astonishing number.
Astonishing short period of time. Sorry to interrupt you.
Right.
Enormous increase, yes.
And I think glyphosate is I think if you took away the glyphosate, the numbers would start going down. And I feel very frustrated that our government doesn't even bother to measure how much glyphosate is in our food. Other people are measuring. I just saw a study on oats that they tested a number of different oat products for glyphosate. Every one of them was contaminated, and the highest level was 1,100 parts per billion, which is very large. So oat, Cheerios is a very popular food with children, loaded with glyphosate. Oatmeal cookies, oatmeal. I mean, it's just the little
innocent names, but such a danger behind it. Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, children really love these snacks, the little goldfish crackers and the Oreo cookies. These are so popular. They're all contaminated with glyphosate. And, we're just, our government refuses to even consider the possibility that glyphosate might be toxic to humans. They consider it to be a wonderful herbicide, kills all plants except for those that have been engineered to resist it, completely harmless to humans. And it's just like, it's disbelief to think that that could possibly be true.
If we will look in the future, I'm not going to ask you on a 100% scale what is the percentage of very negative and where is the hope, but still to be on a positive way and take the platform that humanity still remains some instinct for survival. What is your vision? What can we do, and what kind of a power science has?
Right. No, I think there's hope, and I think, for example, just take glyphosate. If we do finally, Mexico has decided to phase glyphosate out by 2024. I'm very, very excited about that. The United States has been trying to pressure them not to, but they're so far standing their ground. And the U.S. is worried, and I hope it happens, that Mexico will start refusing to import our food because our food is too highly contaminated with glyphosate. I really, really hope that happens, because if we keep trying to bully Mexico into accepting our toxic food, At some point we're going to have to give in and admit that our food is toxic and stop making it. So I think when you have countries next door like Mexico taking that kind of action, it's a very big sign to the U.S. And then when you have the population of the U.S. increasing, the consumption of organic food is going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate. No surprise there, because people are realizing if I'm going to reduce my glyphosate load, I need to eat certified organic. So more and more people, there's a lot of demand in this country for certified organic, and we can't come close to meeting our demand. We have to import a good bit of our certified organic food because we can't produce it. Farmers are going to have to realize either they're going to poison their crops and get sick themselves, with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or whatever, or they have to try to convert their fields to certified organic. So I think we need to find a way to do that. It's not fair to the certified organic farmers that the government subsidizes the toxic food. If the government would take away those subsidies and give them to the organic farmers instead, that would change the cost differential between the two kinds of food. Right now, the certified organic seems so expensive. It seems out of reach for a lot of people.
Yes.
But you could improve that with technology as well. And I have a friend who's involved with producing a tractor. It's a small tractor that runs on solar energy, and it can self-drive, and it knows how to kill weeds without using toxic chemicals. And so it has vision, this kind of using our high-tech capabilities to figure out how to grow crops efficiently without requiring a lot of manual labor and not using chemicals. This is what we need to be focused on. I wish the government would just take as much money as they could and put it and invest it in these people, in these, organizations that are producing these solutions for how to grow crops organically, and also how to fix the soil, how to renew the soil, how to sustainable, renewable agriculture. I mean, these are buzzwords that are going on in our country, and there are a lot of people who are devoting their lives to figuring out, first of all, how to clean up the soil,
yes,
how to enrich the soil, because the soil has been depleted in its minerals. I mean, glyphosate does a terrible job on killing off the microbes in the soil, the mycorrhizome. I mean, there's just all these different damage that happens to the soil. And what also happens is when it rains, the soil runs off because it doesn't have enough organic matter anymore. The soil is very, very susceptible to erosion, and it's sensitivity to drought. I mean, all these things are a consequence of all these poisons that we've been dumping into our soil for so many years. We have to wake up and realize we have to reverse the process. And the good news is that if we do that, not only do we fix the food, but we also potentially fix the climate, because we have this huge problem with climate change, which is due to these gases, carbon dioxide, but even, for example, nitrous oxide, methane, all these gases that are being released. We would reverse that if we can fix the soil and have the carbon get captured in the soil instead of being released into the air, by virtue of making our soil very, very healthy and growing crops on it, even just weeds, if you will, just to get the carbon out of the air. I think that could really help to reverse, not only stop, but reverse this climate change disaster, that it may be the thing that takes us down if we don't do something soon. So I mean, we have so many fronts in which we're on the edge, and I think just recognizing that toxic chemicals have no place in agriculture, and that's not just glyphosate. All the herbicides are toxic. Probably all of the insecticides are toxic, the fungicides, all of those that they use on the crops. We need to get rid of them. It's really sad, because I just saw a show last night on the bats, and the bats in America are being decimated by this fungus. They have this white nose fungus problem, which I think is a consequence of their weakened immune system due to glyphosate. And so they're eating all these insects that are carrying glyphosate because they're eating the crops that have all the glyphosate in them. The bats are being killed by the glyphosate from the insects they're eating. And so then the bats die, and now the insects don't get eaten by the bats. So you have a much bigger problem with insects on your crops because the bats aren't working. And now you have to use even more insecticides. It's a complete vicious cycle, a downward death spiral that we just have to recognize and stop doing this. The more we use these chemicals, the more trouble we get with it, disrupting the natural ecosystem that would have made the problem much, much less of a problem than it is. So now we're facing a situation where we don't have the natural predators to help us out with things like controlling insects. But if we keep on using these toxic chemicals, and we're wiping out the bumblebees and the butterflies as well, I mean, we just have to stop doing this. All of it, not just glyphosate, all of it.
I have to say it was quite pleasant realization for us once we moved into Belgium. Mentality is quite different. Backyards much smaller than some of them in the United States. Concept of owning land obviously different, but mentality to have your own a little farming place. It's not surprising that when we take a walk, we see chicken crossing the roads. We see goats and chicken live very happily together. I talk to them every day. But there is a certain natural, not even heavily spoken how important that is. It's in a part of the mentality, part of bringing up. Farmers markets are extremely popular, and they are pushing people to realize, to appreciate, to get to invest money in those farm markets rather than to go to supermarket. And to appreciate shelf life shorter than a longer. Prices, yes, more affordable than in the United States. I must tell you, United States, Whole Foods became very, very expensive, very stiff. Even the choice, and even organic is not always certified properly. It is much better. Also, I think the difference is in bringing up children. They don't have mentality that much with excessive amount of wasting, of some kind of taking advantage of Mother Nature. So what you're saying is so critically valuable, which brings me to the last point, before very last point, about your book. You said it's going to be in June.
I think June 24th is the date we're targeting, June 24th.
And what's the name of it again?
Toxic Legacy. And then it's how the weed killer glyphosate is destroying our health and the environment.
It's a wonderful title. It's
Thank you.
Fantastic, strong symphony. How can you miss it? Very last question. When you are in a scientific flow, do you have automatic connection with Mother Nature, with what takes place in life? Or it's a very separate entity and it takes time to make connections between those two?
Life and well, I love nature and I love taking walks in nature. I love walking on the beach, and I get out in the woods. I go deep into the woods and get lost in there. I love nature, so I do feel almost like communion with God when I'm in the woods with nobody around but me and the trees, So I do have a strong sense of nature. As a child, I was fascinated by all the insects and frogs and all the different animals that we found, the praying mantises and the flying bats. They were all really, really fun to me. And right now I live part-time in Hawaii, and we have albatross that nest in the residential areas. We have a baby albatross just a couple doors down from my house, with the parents so excited and so thrilled to have this baby. And it's just so sweet to see the albatross soar past my window. And I look up and I smile. So I feel really very strong communion with nature. I feed the birds, and I have like literally 100 or more birds that are swarming down on my bird feeder every day. I feed them every day. So yes, I am very much in touch with nature. I love nature. It pains me that humans are basically destroying everything. I think we have a possibility that we will wipe out all life on Earth. I think it's a possibility. It's not a completely crazy idea. I hope we don't. I think we can reverse what we're doing if we can just wake up. We just need to recognize that the path we're on is not sustainable, very destructive, and whether we go extinct ourselves or whether we kill off everybody, I'm not sure which, but one of those dangers or both are definitely possible. And I think we just need to acknowledge that we're doing things wrong, and we need to direct our technology towards solutions that are in the right path without using the toxic chemicals. I think the critical thing is don't use the toxic chemicals. Find a way. Even if it involves technology, that's fine, but just don't use the toxic chemicals.
I like to unwillingly finish our extraordinary conversation, which is extraordinary not only because your scientific limitless horizon, but because you feel so comfortable in shifting from nature, human life, and science with its complexities and its known and unknown. So I wanted firstly to thank you very much for what you're doing with such brave, independent, and yet extraordinarily informed way. And also I wanted to hope that we can continue this conversation, if your time permits, with particular being grateful for the fact that people can learn so much from you, regardless their education, regardless motivation, or perhaps some frustration. So I feel that everyone will find their own most valuable piece of information, and I hope that vibration of the world will suit your research. We will all look forward for your book, and it is a very scary time, particularly because some people are confused and they're not even admitting to their confusion. Internet is a huge plus and yet huge misleading force. Politicians are not always with the right cooperation with the scientists. So there are issues which are very hard to comprehend and to sort them out. You did, however. So thank you so much. We deeply appreciate, and we hope that perhaps spring with some summer flow will bring some even stronger, fresh hope. Thank you. That was Professor Stephanie Seneff from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, from one of the central point of the world science and humanity, where Professor Stephanie Seneff plays extraordinarily critical, irreplaceable, and very progressive role. Thank you so much, and hope until soon.
Thank you so much for having me.